In the second year of what Issei had privately begun to think of as his new and considerably stranger life, the quiet that had settled over Ko since Rizavim's final, unresolved farewell carried a depth that made the old vigilance, the constant low-grade readiness for the next crisis, feel increasingly like a habit rather than a genuine necessity. He had grown, in that year, in ways that extended well beyond the steady mastery of the gray light, taller by a measure that made his mother comment on it at every family dinner, more settled in his own bearing, the particular confidence of a young man who had weathered considerable strangeness and found, on the other side of it, a self he genuinely recognized and respected. The tree in the training yard had grown alongside him, its pale silvered branches now reaching well above his head, and he had taken, in quiet moments, to adding small things around it, a low stone bench, a careful arrangement of gray-blossomed shrubs that bloomed, gently, in patterns no ordinary botany could have explained, each addition a small, deliberate act of creation offered simply because he wanted the world to hold a little more beauty than it had before he arrived in it. It was in one of these quiet moments, tending the small garden that had grown up around the original tree, that Issei first felt the wrongness, faint and distant, the particular instinctive unease he had learned, over the preceding year, never to dismiss as imagination. He could not have named, in that first instant, exactly what troubled him. The gray light at his fingertips, normally settled into easy, contented stillness, had stirred instead into something more watchful, the way a sleeping animal stirs at a sound too distant and too faint for conscious hearing to fully register. He stood very still amid his small garden, listening to a silence that held, beneath its ordinary surface, the faint suggestion of something vast shifting somewhere very far away. "Drag," he said quietly. "Do you feel that?" "I do," the dragon said, and something in his ancient voice carried a gravity Issei had not heard from him since the earliest, most uncertain weeks of this entire journey. "I am not certain what it is. But I have lived a very long time, partner, and I have learned to trust the particular quality of unease that comes before something genuinely significant. This is that quality." Rias found him there a few minutes later, drawn by some instinct of her own, and the moment she crossed into the small garden's quiet, her expression sharpened immediately, the king's careful awareness picking up the same faint, distant wrongness Issei had felt moments before. "What is it?" she asked. "I don't know," Issei admitted. "It's not like anything before. Not Rizavim, not the entropy faction, not even Olympus. It feels older than all of that. Further away." He looked toward the horizon, though there was nothing visible there to explain the unease settling over him. "It feels like something is watching from very far off, and has just decided, for the first time, to actually look closely." The feeling did not resolve immediately into anything concrete, and the days that followed carried a strange, suspended quality, the ordinary rhythm of Ko continuing unbothered around them while the small, watchful unease at the edges of Issei's awareness slowly, gradually sharpened into something he could no longer dismiss as imagination. It was Nyx who finally gave the feeling its proper shape, arriving unannounced 8 days later with none of her usual measured calm, her ancient features carrying, for the first time since Issei had known her, something that looked unmistakably like genuine alarm. "You have felt it," she said, without preamble, the moment she crossed into the training yard's quiet. "I can see it in your bearing." "Good. That means the warning has not come too late." "Felt what?" Rias asked, already moving to Issei's side. "What's happening?" "There is a being," Nyx said, her layered voice carrying a weight that settled over the training yard like a held breath, "older than Olympus, older than the entropy faction, older, I believe, than nearly everything currently active in this world. We do not speak of it often, even among ourselves, because we have believed, for a very long span of years, that it had withdrawn entirely from active concern with the world we built atop the first condition's foundation." Her dark eyes found Issei's, holding a gravity that made the gray light at his fingertips stir, instinctively, in response. It called itself, in the oldest tongues that survive even in my memory, the unmade. A being born, as I understand it, from the same first condition that births you, but shaped by a very different inheritance, one that remembers chaos not as the silent potential from which all things might be built, but as the perfect, undisturbed stillness that existed before anything troubled it into becoming something else. It thinks creation was a mistake, Issei said slowly, understanding arriving with unwelcome clarity. I believe so, Nyx confirmed. I believe it has watched, across the long ages, as gods and devils and angels and every other power built their elaborate structures atop the foundation of the first condition, and I believe it has come, slowly and patiently, to resent every act of creation as a kind of violence against the perfect stillness it remembers and longs to see restored. Her expression carried genuine fear now, the first Issei had ever seen from her. And I believe, watching what you have built across this past year, the tree, the garden, the alliances, the careful, deliberate choosing of creation over unmaking again and again, it has finally, after a very long and patient silence, decided that you represent something it can no longer ignore. The training yard had gone very still, the small garden's gray blossoms swaying gently in a breeze that suddenly felt, to Issei, considerably colder than it had moments before. What does it want? Rias asked, her voice carrying the particular steadiness she reserved for genuine crisis. I do not know with certainty, Nyx admitted. But I fear, given everything I understand of its nature, that it wants what it has always wanted, across the long ages of its patient watching. It wants the silence restored. It wants the accumulated weight of all this world's creation, every god, every devil, every careful structure built since the beginning, returned to the perfect stillness it remembers. And I fear, watching what you represent, a being capable of both creation and unmaking on a scale this world has never before encountered, it has begun to wonder whether you might be the key it has waited all this time to find. Issei felt the weight of the revelation settle over him slowly, a cold and unwelcome echo of every fear he had worked, across the preceding year, to set carefully aside. You mean it wants to use me, he said. The same way Ryzavim wanted to use me. The same way the Entropy faction wondered if it could. No, Nyx said, and something in her voice carried a gravity that made the distinction land with considerably more weight than any reassurance could have offered. Ryzavim wanted a weapon he could direct. The Entropy faction wanted to understand whether you represented threat or opportunity within the balance they maintain. The Unmade wants something considerably simpler, and considerably more total. It does not want to use you as a tool towards some other end. It wants you to become, willingly or otherwise, the instrument of its own oldest and most patient desire. It wants the world unmade, completely, and it has come to believe, watching you these past months, that you might be the only being in existence capable of actually accomplishing that ending. The wind stilled completely around the training yard, the same unnerving quiet that had heralded Nyx's first visit a year before, and somewhere beyond the visible horizon, Issei felt, for the first time since this entire journey began, the genuine, gravitational pull of something vast and ancient and patient finally, fully turning its full attention toward him. Then I guess, he said quietly, the old fear settling into something steadier, harder, the particular resolve of a person who had spent a year learning exactly what he was capable of choosing, it's about to learn it picked the wrong instrument. The political fallout from Nyx's warning arrived faster than anyone had anticipated, the careful, hard-won alliances of the preceding year suddenly tested by a threat considerably larger and more abstract than anything the underworld's established structures had ever needed to formally address. Surzex convened the emergency session within 2 days, and this time, unlike the previous gatherings that had debated Issei's status with at least the comfortable framework of devil politics to structure the conversation, the assembled powers found themselves grappling with something that fell outside every existing category of threat assessment they possessed. The Unmade is not a faction we can simply negotiate with, Surzex explained, his expression carrying a gravity Issei had never seen from him before, even in the tensest moments of the preceding year. It is not seeking territory, or political advantage, or even the kind of philosophical satisfaction the Entropy faction wanted from its tests. By every account Nyx and Ananke have offered, it wants the complete unmaking of everything that exists, and it has apparently decided, after a very long and patient watching, that Issei represents its best chance of achieving that goal. Then the obvious response is to keep him as far from this being as possible, Falbium Asmodeus said, his characteristically measured tone carrying an unusual edge of genuine concern. If proximity is what this threat requires, distance becomes our most reliable defense. It's not that simple, Issei said, and the entire assembled council turned toward him, the various Satans and their advisors absorbing, for the first time, direct testimony from the boy whose existence had occupied so much of their careful political attention over the preceding year. Nick said it's been watching me for a long time already. I don't think distance is really an option anymore, even if I wanted it to be. And honestly, I don't think hiding is the right answer regardless. If this thing wants to use what I am to unmake the world, running from it doesn't actually stop that from being possible. It just means I'm not ready when it finally comes looking. He's right, Rias said, stepping forward with the same fierce, protective certainty that had carried her through every previous crisis on his behalf. And I'd add something else worth considering. This council spent considerable effort, a year ago, debating whether Issei represented a danger that needed containing. We've spent the months since watching him prove, again and again, exactly what he actually chooses to become when given genuine freedom to choose it. I think the answer to this new threat isn't retreat. I think it's trust, finally and fully extended, in the choice he's already demonstrated he consistently makes. The council's deliberations stretched across the better part of a full day, and it was in the midst of those careful, difficult discussions that the first crack in the alliance's unity finally surfaced, arriving not from any of the established Satans but from a minor noble house representative whose family had, for generations, harbored quiet sympathies toward the old purist factions that had never fully reconciled with the underworld's modern political structure. With respect, the representative said, his tone carrying a careful, deliberate formality that did little to soften the implication beneath his words, I think this council is allowing sentiment to cloud sound judgment. We have, in this room, direct testimony from an ancient and powerful being that the boy in question represents a potential catalyst for the complete unmaking of existence. I understand the affection this council has developed for him, given his evident good character across the preceding year. But good character is not the same as guaranteed safety, and I would remind this council that the entropy faction's earlier testing came considerably closer to genuine catastrophe than the official reports have fully acknowledged. Are you suggesting containment? Serzek said, his voice carrying a coldness that made clear exactly how unwelcome he found the proposal, even before it had been fully articulated. I am suggesting, the representative said carefully, that this council consider, seriously and without sentiment, whether the safest course of action might involve isolating the boy from circumstances that could be exploited by a being of this magnitude, rather than continuing to expose him, and by extension the entire underworld, to escalating risk in the name of trust that, however well earned, cannot fully account for a threat operating on the scale Nix has described. The room fell into a tense, uncertain silence, and Issei felt, watching the careful, considering expressions of several council members who had not immediately rejected the representative's suggestion, the old, familiar fear resurface, the particular vulnerability of being discussed as a problem to be managed rather than a person whose own voice carried weight in determining his own future. I won't be contained, he said before anyone else could speak, his voice carrying a steadiness that drew every eye in the room back toward him. I understand the fear. I do. I've spent a year understanding exactly how dangerous I could be if I made different choices than the ones I've actually made. But containing me doesn't make the unmade's interest in me disappear. It just removes every ally and every safeguard I've spent this past year building, at exactly the moment I'm going to need them most. He looked around the room, meeting the gaze of every Satan, every advisor, every representative who had gathered to debate his fate as though he were not capable of speaking for himself. I'd rather face this threat surrounded by people who trust me, even if that trust comes with real risk, than face it alone in whatever isolated containment this council decides feels safer for everyone except me. It was Serafal, surprisingly, who broke the tension that followed, her usual playful energy entirely absent, replaced by a quiet, serious conviction that carried unexpected weight given how rarely she allowed her formal authority to show through her customary lightness. I've watched this boy choose creation over destruction in front of an entropy faction that came specifically hoping to provoke the opposite, she said. I've watched him hold a defensive wall against attackers when unmaking them would have ended the fight faster and easier. I've watched my sister speak of him with a respect she extends to almost no one outside her own peerage. I am not willing to abandon that evidence now, simply because the scale of the threat has grown larger than our previous experience prepared us for. She looked at the minor noble representative with an expression that left no ambiguity about her position. If anything, I think the scale of this threat is exactly the reason we need him standing with us, trusted and supported, rather than isolated and afraid. The unmade wants unmaking. I don't think isolating Issei from everyone who loves him serves any purpose except making that outcome more likely, not less. The Council's final position, when it finally settled hours later, fell decisively against containment, the weight of a year's accumulated trust proving, in the end, considerably more durable than the minor noble faction's careful fear-mongering had hoped to exploit. But the debate itself left its mark regardless, a reminder, sharp and unwelcome, that the alliance Issei had built across the preceding year, however genuine and however hard-won, remained, in moments of genuine crisis, vulnerable to exactly the kind of fear the unmade's mere existence had already begun to provoke. That was closer than I'd like, Rias admitted, as they walked back to Ko in the gathering dusk, the weight of the day's deliberation settling heavily over both of them. Yeah, Issei agreed quietly. I think that's exactly what worries me most about all this. Not the unmade itself, not yet. I haven't even met it. But the way its existence alone is already starting to crack things that took a whole year to build. He looked at her, the old, familiar resolve settling beneath the fresh unease of the day's revelations. I think whatever this thing wants from me, it's not going to wait much longer to come ask for it directly. He was right, as it turned out, though even his own carefully tempered expectations had not prepared him for exactly how soon, or exactly how personal, that direct approach would prove to be. The unmade came to him 3 nights later, and unlike every previous encounter with the old, strange powers that had taken an interest in his existence, this one did not arrive in the training yard, or on a quiet street beneath a familiar streetlight, or anywhere within the ordinary architecture of his waking life at all. It came to him in sleep, in a space that held no walls and no floor, lit only by a faint and distant glow that Issei's thoughts slid carefully away from whenever he tried to look at it directly, and he understood, with the particular dream logic that makes impossible things feel immediately, unquestionably real, that he had stood in this exact space once before, in the earliest days of this entire journey. In a half-remembered dream he had dismissed, at the time, as nothing more than ordinary sleep wandering somewhere strange. You remember this place, a voice said, and it carried none of the layered depth of Nyx's voice, none of Ananke's ancient gravity. It carried, instead, a quality of perfect, total stillness, the particular silence of a held breath that has never once, in its entire existence, needed to release. This is where I came from, Issei said, understanding arriving with the strange, total clarity dreams sometimes offered, clearer in its way than waking thought ever managed. Before any of it. Before Ko, before my family, before any of this began. Yes, the voice agreed, and a shape began, slowly, to resolve out of the formless dark, not a figure exactly, but a suggestion of one, edges that held no fixed boundary, light that moved through it rather than reflecting from any surface. This is the silence before sound. The stillness before the first word troubled it into becoming something else. This is where everything you are first existed, before it was ever asked to become anything at all. And you're the thing that wants it to go back to being only that, Issei said. The warning Nyx had carried days before settling into clear, present recognition. You're the unmade. I am, the voice confirmed, with no trace of denial, no attempt at the careful manipulation Ryzavim had once favored. And I have come, child, not to threaten you, not to test you the way the others have tested you across this past year. I have come to offer you something I do not believe anyone else in your life has ever managed to offer, because I do not believe anyone else in your life has ever truly understood what you actually are. What's that? Issei asked, though some careful, watchful part of him already braced against whatever answer was coming. I offer you rest, the voice said, and something in its perfect, total stillness carried, for the first time, a quality that might, in a being capable of warmth, have approached something like gentleness. You have spent this past year fighting, constantly, against the loneliness of being unprecedented. Tested by devils who wanted to use you. Tested by an entropy faction that wondered whether you were friend or weapon. Tested by gods who watched you from a careful, curious distance, never quite certain whether you belonged among them or apart from them entirely. You have built alliances, child, and I do not doubt they bring you genuine comfort. But I wonder, in the quiet hours when even those alliances cannot reach you, whether you have ever truly stopped feeling alone in what you are. The words landed with an uncomfortable, unwelcome precision, touching something Issei had not fully admitted, even to himself, in the careful, settled confidence of the preceding months, a quiet, persistent ache that lived beneath even his closest friendships, the particular isolation of being the only one of his kind in an entire vast and crowded world. That doesn't mean I want to unmake everything, Issei said, though his voice carried, for the first time in this strange dream conversation, a note of genuine uncertainty. I am not asking you to unmake everything, the unmade said. Not in the manner you fear. I am asking you to consider simply what it might feel like to return, fully and completely, to the place you actually came from. Not destruction, child. Homecoming. You have spent this entire year being asked to become something, by every power that has taken an interest in you, devil and god and primordial alike. I am the only one, I think, who has ever asked you instead what it might feel like to simply stop becoming, and rest, finally, in the perfect stillness that birthed you. And what happens to everyone else, Issei said, the question arriving with sharper clarity now, cutting through the strange, seductive pull of the offer. To Rias. To my parents. To everyone I actually love. What happens to them if I just go back to being silence? The unmade was quiet for a long moment, and when it spoke again, its voice carried, for the first time, something that might have been the careful evasion of a being unused to having its offers questioned so directly. They would return as well, it said. Not destroyed, child. Simply unmade, the way a held breath releases, the way a wave returns to the sea it was always part of. There is no pain in it. Only stillness, complete and total, exactly as everything was before the first word disturbed it. That's destruction, Issei said, the dream's strange clarity sharpening into something hard and certain. You can dress it up however gently you want. That's still everyone I love gone. That's still everything anyone has ever built, gone. I don't care how peaceful you make it sound. That's not homecoming. That's an ending, and you're asking me to be the one who causes it. I am asking you, the unmade said, its perfect stillness wavering, just slightly, with something that might have been the first genuine frustration it had shown, to consider that perhaps an ending is not the tragedy your mortal mind has been conditioned to believe it must be. I have watched this world accumulate creation upon creation for longer than your kind has had the words to properly measure that span. I have watched the weight of it grow, year upon year, century upon century, and I have come to believe, across all that long and patient watching, that the kindest thing left to do, for every being currently straining beneath that accumulated weight, is to finally, gently, let it all return to rest. That's not kindness, Issei said. That's just unmaking dressed up in nicer words. I've had someone try that on me before, sort of. Different angle, but same basic idea, that the easy answer, the unmaking answer, is somehow the truer or better one. He felt, even in the strange, dream logic of this confrontation, the steady ground of everything he had built across the preceding year settling firmly beneath him. I'm not interested. Not in homecoming, not in rest, not in any version of this you want to offer me. I choose creation. I've chosen it every single time it actually mattered, and I'm choosing it again right now, in whatever this place actually is. The formless shape of the unmade held very still, the dream space around them seeming to hold its breath alongside it, and when the voice finally answered, it carried a quality Issei had not expected, not anger, not disappointment, but something that sounded, unsettlingly, like patient, certain calculation. You have answered as I expected you would, it said. Gently, then, was never going to be sufficient, I think, though I judged it worth attempting regardless, given what genuine kindness I am still capable of extending. The dream space began, slowly, to dissolve around them, the faint, unlookable glow at its center beginning to fade. I will not ask gently again, child. But know that my patience, unlike the patience of every other power who has tested you this past year, does not run on any timeline your mortal life can meaningfully outlast. I have waited since before your kind existed at all. I am content to wait a great deal longer yet, if waiting eventually wears down the resolve you have offered me so confidently tonight. Issei woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in his own bed, his heart pounding with an intensity that took several long minutes to settle, the lingering, unwelcome weight of the conversation pressing against his chest with a heaviness he had not felt since the earliest, most frightened weeks of this entire journey. He did not sleep again that night, and when morning finally arrived, he found himself, for the first time in months, genuinely uncertain how to explain, even to Rias, exactly how deeply the unmaid's careful, gentle offer of rest had managed to touch something in him that every previous threat, however dangerous, had never quite reached. Rias noticed the change in him before he managed to find the words to explain it, the particular quiet, inward stillness that settled over Issei in the days following the dream visitation, a quality she had not seen from him since the earliest, most frightened weeks after the raiding game, and she gave him 2 full days of careful, patient space before finally drawing him aside, on the third evening. With the gentle but unmistakable firmness of someone who had decided enough time had passed. "Tell me what's actually going on," she said, settling beside him on their familiar bench beneath the now towering gray tree. "And please don't tell me it's nothing. I've watched you carry difficult things before, Issei. This is different. This feels like something is pulling you away, even when you're sitting right next to me." Issei was quiet for a long moment, turning over exactly how to explain the strange, unwelcome ache the unmaid's offer had left behind, an ache that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a loneliness he had not fully admitted, even to himself, until a primordial being of pure stillness had named it for him with uncomfortable precision. "It came to me in a dream," he said finally. "The unmaid. 3 nights ago. It didn't threaten me, not really. It offered me something instead." He looked down at his hands, the gray light settled there in its familiar quiet, though something in its stillness felt, to him now, slightly more fragile than it had before. "It asked me if I was tired of being alone in what I am. And the worst part, Rias, the part one haven't been able to shake since, is that some part of me actually had to think about the answer before I could honestly say no." Rias's expression carried no judgment, only a careful, attentive seriousness that made it easier, somehow, for Issei to continue. "I've got you. I've got the peerage. I've got Nyx and Ananke and even Hermes, in his own way. I know that logically. But none of them are actually like me, Rias. None of them know what it's like to be the only one of something, in the entire vast world, with no other being anywhere who shares the particular strangeness of what I carry. The unmaid does. It's the only thing I've ever met that actually came from the exact same place I did. And it offered me something that sounded, for one terrible moment in that dream, like it might actually be relief, instead of just another fight to win." "What did it actually offer?" Rias asked gently. "Specifically? I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with." "Rest," Issei said. "Going home," it called it. "Returning everything, including me, including you, including everyone, back to the stillness before the first word." It tried to make it sound peaceful. Gentle, even. And for about half a second, in the dream, some exhausted part of me that I didn't even know I was carrying actually wondered what that might feel like. Rias was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of what he had shared, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a steadiness that settled, gradually, over the unease that had been building in Issei across the preceding days. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't scare me," she said honestly. "Hearing that something offered you an ending dressed up as peace, and that some part of you, even briefly, found that offer tempting. That's not a small thing, Issei, and I don't want to brush past it just to make either of us feel more comfortable." She took his hand, holding it with the same firm, grounding certainty she had carried through every previous crisis. "But I also don't think the temptation you felt means what the unmaid probably hoped it would mean. I think it means you're tired, genuinely and honestly tired, in a way you haven't let yourself fully admit because you've been so focused on being strong enough to handle everything this past year has thrown at you." "Maybe," Issei admitted. "But that doesn't change the fact that it found something real to push on. A genuine loneliness, not just a manufactured weakness like Ryzavim tried to exploit. I don't know how to fight something that's offering me an honest answer to an honest ache." "You don't fight it by pretending the ache isn't real," Rias said. "You fight it by remembering that the unmaid's answer to that ache is still the wrong answer, even if the ache itself is genuine." She squeezed his hand, her eyes steady and certain on his. You're not actually alone, Issei. Not in the way it wants you to believe. Yes, none of us share your exact nature. But loneliness isn't only about finding someone identical to yourself. It's about being truly known and truly chosen, even in your difference. And I think, if you let yourself actually look at this past year clearly, you'll see that's exactly what you've built here. Not sameness. Something better than sameness. People who chose you, specifically because of what makes you different, not in spite of it. Issei sat with her words for a long moment, feeling something in his chest, tight and aching since the dream 3 nights before, begin, gradually, to loosen. Drake's voice rose quietly into the conversation, carrying a gentleness Issei had come to associate with the dragon's most carefully considered insights. I have something to add, partner, if you will permit it. I am, in my own fashion, also unprecedented. There has never been another dragon quite like me, bound across so many centuries to so many different hosts, carrying the particular weight of a legend that sets me apart even from my own kind. I understand, better than perhaps anyone else currently standing with you, exactly the loneliness the unmade tried to exploit tonight in your dream. I will tell you what I have learned, across all my centuries of carrying that particular weight. The loneliness never fully disappears. I do not think it can, for beings like us, built from something the world has never quite seen before. But it becomes bearable, genuinely bearable, not because you find another being exactly like yourself, but because you choose, again and again, to let the people who are different from you actually matter anyway. I have had hosts I loved as deeply as any dragon has ever loved anything, partner, despite the fact that not one of them carried a single drop of dragon's blood in their veins. The difference never made the love less real. If anything, I have come to believe, across all my long centuries, that it made it more remarkable, more deliberately chosen, considerably more meaningful than love built simply on easy, effortless sameness would ever have managed to be. Issei felt something in him settle, fully and completely, at the dragon's words, the careful, accumulated weight of the unmate's offer finally losing, in the warm and steady company of the people who had chosen him across the preceding year, the particular gravitational pull it had carried in the cold, formless space of that dream. Thank you, he said to both of them, the words carrying a depth that extended well beyond simple gratitude. I think I needed to hear both of those things, honestly. The thing about being known instead of being identical. And the thing about love staying real even when it isn't built on sameness. He looked up at the towering gray tree above them, its pale branches stirring gently in the evening breeze. I think I understand now why the unmade offered me that, specifically. It's not trying to break me through fear, the way Ryzavim did. It's trying to break me through genuine grief, genuine loneliness, the parts of being what I am that actually do hurt, even now, even with everything I've built. Then we'll keep building, anyway, Rhea said simply. Loudly enough that whatever quiet ache it's trying to exploit eventually stops being able to find purchase at all. Issei smiled at her, the first genuine, settled smile he had managed since the dream 3 nights before, and felt, beneath the lingering unease of knowing the unmate's patience remained considerably longer than any mortal timeline could meaningfully outlast, a renewed and steady resolve settle into place, the hard-won understanding that whatever came next, he would not be facing it from the cold, isolated stillness the unmade had tried to make sound like home. He would be facing it, instead, exactly as he had faced every previous trial across this remarkable year, surrounded by people who had chosen him, deliberately and completely, precisely because of everything that made him different from them rather than in spite of it. The unmade's escalation, when it finally arrived, came with a coldness and a precision that made clear, immediately, exactly how thoroughly its patience had run out, and exactly how carefully it had studied the architecture of everything Issei had built across the preceding year in order to threaten the precise foundation most likely to provoke the response it wanted. It struck on an ordinary afternoon, during a quiet training session in the yard beneath the now towering tree, the kind of session that had become, over the preceding months, comfortable and almost routine, Rias overseeing drills while Aquino and Kiba ran their own paired exercises nearby, Kaneko anchoring the formation's center with her usual grounded patience. The wrongness arrived without warning, the same total, gravitational stillness Issei had felt in his dream 3 nights before, except this time fully present, fully manifest, settling over the training yard with a weight that made every ordinary sound simply cease: the birds, the distant traffic beyond the school grounds, even the rustle of the trees' pale leaves. All of it falling silent at once beneath the sheer presence of something that had, at last, decided gentle persuasion had run its course. "I told you," the voice said, resolving out of a darkness that seemed to swallow the afternoon light rather than simply occupy it, "that my patience does not run on a timeline your mortal life can meaningfully outlast. I find, having considered the matter further, that I am no longer willing to wait for you to arrive at the correct answer on your own." "Get away from them," Issei said immediately, stepping forward, gray light flaring bright at his fingertips, every instinct in him sharpening toward protection rather than the careful, deliberate stillness he had practiced across the preceding months. "I have no intention of harming your companions directly," the unmade said, and something in its perfect, total voice carried an edge of genuine cruelty Issei had not heard from it in their dream conversation, the gentle, patient offering of homecoming entirely abandoned now in favor of something considerably more direct. "I intend, instead, to show you exactly how fragile the foundation you have built around yourself actually is, and exactly how easily it could be unmade, should you continue to refuse the gift I have offered you." The darkness surrounding the training yard began, slowly and with deliberate, gathering pressure, to press inward, and Issei felt, with a sick lurch of recognition, the particular quality of unmaking directed not at any single target but at the entire space itself, at the tree, at the small garden, at the very ground his friends stood upon, a slow, patient erosion that promised, given enough time, to simply dissolve the entire training yard back into the perfect, undisturbed stillness the unmade had spent its long existence longing to see restored. "Issei," Rias called out, her power flaring bright in immediate, desperate defense, though even her considerable strength seemed, against the sheer scale of what pressed against them, like a single candle held against an encroaching tide. "What do we do?" He felt the old, familiar pull then, sharp and immediate, the easy, gravitational temptation of meeting unmaking with unmaking, of reaching for the full, unrestrained scope of what slept beneath his ribs and simply tearing the thread apart before it could finish whatever it intended to do to the people he loved. The gray light surged at his fingertips, eager and willing, and for one long, terrible moment, Issei felt himself teeter on the edge of exactly the response the unmade had likely hoped to provoke all along, the catastrophic, uncontrolled unmaking that would prove, to every doubting power watching from the careful distance of the wider world, that he truly was the danger the minor noble faction had feared him to be. He did not take that step. He thought, instead, in the single suspended instant before instinct could fully overwhelm him, of the tree. Of the small gray blossoms he had grown, deliberately, around its base. Of Rhea staying late in this exact training yard, evening after evening, helping him learn to choose creation over the easier pull of destruction. Of Drake's voice in the dark of his bedroom, 3 nights before, speaking of love that mattered more, not less, for being built on difference rather than sameness. He chose, in that single suspended instant, exactly as he had chosen every time it had actually mattered across this entire long and difficult year. "No," he said, and his voice, when it emerged, carried none of the panic the unmade had clearly hoped to provoke, only a hard, settled certainty that seemed, for a moment, to actually give the encroaching darkness pause. "You don't get to make me destroy what I love just to prove your point. I'm not going to fight unmaking with unmaking. I'm going to fight it the way I've fought everything else this entire year." He reached, instead of for destruction, for the deepest, most deliberate reservoir of the creative power he had spent months carefully cultivating, and where the unmade's encroaching darkness pressed against the training yard's edges, Issei answered not with an equal and opposite unmaking but with a wall of pure, deliberate creation. Gray light blooming outward from his open palms in a structure considerably larger and more ambitious than anything he had attempted before, root and branch and solid, ancient stone weaving together into a barrier that did not merely resist the unmade's pressing dark but actively, defiantly, grew against it. "Interesting," the unmade said, and for the first time since its arrival, something in its perfect stillness wavered, genuine surprise breaking through the cold, gathering pressure of its assault. "You would meet my unmaking with creation, even now, even with everything you love standing directly in harm's way?" Especially now, Issei said, the growing barrier solidifying further with each passing second, root and stone and gray light weaving into something that felt, increasingly, like an answer rather than simply a defense. You wanted to prove I'd become a weapon if you pushed hard enough. You wanted me to unmake something to protect the people I love, because then every doubt anyone's ever had about me would suddenly look justified. I'm not going to give you that. Not today. Not ever, no matter how hard you push. The unmade's pressing darkness held against the growing barrier for a long, suspended moment, the entire training yard caught in a silence so total it felt, to everyone present, like standing at the very edge of something vast and immeasurable, and then, gradually, the darkness began, reluctantly, to withdraw, the pressure easing as the barrier's roots and stone continued their patient, unstoppable growth. This is not finished, the unmade said, its voice retreating along with the darkness, carrying, even in withdrawal, a cold and patient promise that made clear exactly how far from concluded this confrontation actually remained. You have proven, today, considerably more resolve than I expected, child. I will not underestimate it again. But know this. I have existed since before the first word disturbed my perfect stillness, and I am prepared to spend a considerable span of years yet, patiently, carefully, finding the exact pressure that will finally, eventually, break the resolve you have shown me today. It withdrew entirely a moment later, the ordinary afternoon light flooding back into the training yard, the birds resuming their interrupted chorus, and Issei stood, breathing hard, amid the strange and beautiful new growth his desperate, deliberate creation had left behind, root and stone woven into a low, protective wall that would, he understood immediately, remain standing long after the immediate crisis had passed. A permanent and visible testament to exactly the choice he had made when everything he loved had stood directly in harm's way. Rias reached him a moment later, her hands finding his shoulders with the same desperate, grounding urgency she had shown in the aftermath of the raiding game, more than a year before. You held, she said, something fierce and proud breaking through the lingering fear of the preceding minutes. Even with everything on the line, you held exactly to what you said you wanted to become. It was close, Issei admitted, his hands still trembling slightly with the aftermath of the effort. Closer than I want to admit. For half a second, I really did want to just tear it apart. But you didn't, Rias said simply, and the certainty in her voice carried more comfort than any reassurance could have managed. That's what actually matters. Not the half-second of temptation. The choice you made after it. Around them, the rest of the peerage began, slowly, to regroup, exchanging glances that carried equal parts lingering fear and genuine, hard-won pride, and Issei, looking at the strange and beautiful new growth surrounding him, found himself understanding, with a clarity that felt both unsettling and oddly reassuring, that whatever the unmade intended to try next, he had just proven something to himself considerably more important than anything he had proven to the ancient, patient being that had come today, hoping to finally break him. News of the training yard confrontation reached every corner of the careful, accumulated alliance Issei had built across the preceding year within hours, and unlike the previous crises, which had each, in their own way, provoked at least some measure of doubt and division among the watching powers, this particular account seemed to settle, almost universally, into something closer to galvanized resolve. Nyx arrived first, her ancient features carrying an urgency that made clear exactly how seriously she regarded the confrontation's implications. It moved more directly than I feared it would, she said, the moment she crossed into the training yard, her dark eyes finding the strange, beautiful new growth of root and stone with an expression that mixed concern and genuine wonder in equal measure. And yet you held. Against the unmade's direct pressure, with everything you love standing in immediate danger, you chose creation rather than unmaking. She studied the barrier a moment longer, something that might have been awe touching her ancient, depthless features. I confess, child, I did not fully believe such restraint was possible, even after everything I witnessed from you across this past year. I am very glad to have been wrong. Ananke arrived shortly after, her assessment carrying the same careful, measuring gravity she had brought to every previous encounter, though this time her conclusion arrived with considerably more warmth than her usual ancient reserve typically allowed. Your thread, she said, studying Issei with an intensity that made the gray light at his fingertips stir in immediate, instinctive response, has bent further than I believed possible, today, and yet it did not break. I have rarely witnessed a thread hold so firmly against pressure of this magnitude. I think, watching this, that my earlier offer of protection requires expansion, given the scope of what has now made itself known as a genuine and active threat against you. It was Hermes, arriving with considerably less of his usual theatrical flourish than his previous visits had carried, who brought the news that finally crystallized the shape of what needed to happen next. Olympus has voted, he said, settling into the training yard's quiet with an unusual gravity. Formally, and with rather more unanimity than my father's court typically manages on anything. The unmade is recognized, across every faction within Olympus, as a genuine and existential threat, not merely to you, Issei, but to the entire accumulated structure of creation every pantheon and every power has built since the beginning. Athena's argued, quite persuasively, that a threat of this scale requires a response considerably larger than any single faction has ever needed to organize before. He looked around at the gathered powers, Nyx and Ananke and the assembled Gremory peerage all present in the training yard's quiet, weighing the full scope of what was beginning to assemble. Olympus is prepared to commit forces, should the confrontation escalate further. I suspect, given everything I've witnessed today, that escalation is no longer a matter of if. Surzex arrived within the hour, having received the full report through Aquino's careful, urgent relay, and the formal council that convened that same evening carried a unity Issei had not witnessed in any previous gathering. Every Satan, every major house, every faction that had spent the preceding year debating his status now united, without exception, around the shared and urgent recognition that the unmade represented a threat too vast for any single power to face alone. We need a coalition, Surzex said, addressing the assembled powers with the focused, decisive clarity of a leader who understood exactly how much weight the coming days would carry. Not the careful, individual alliances we've each built separately over this past year. Something larger. Something that brings together every power who has reason to oppose what the unmade represents, devil and angel and Olympian and primordial alike, united around a single, shared purpose. You're talking about an alliance unlike anything this world has seen since before the old wars, Azazel said slowly, the weight of the proposal settling over him with visible gravity. Devils and angels and Olympians, standing together, formally, rather than simply maintaining careful, separate truces. I'm talking about exactly that, Surzex confirmed. Because I do not believe any single faction, however powerful, can face what's coming alone, and I am not willing to risk the alternative simply because old grudges make this kind of unity uncomfortable to arrange. The work of actually building that coalition consumed the following week, careful diplomatic negotiations stretching across every faction that had, across the preceding year, taken some measure of interest in Issei's existence. And Issei found himself, watching the painstaking, deliberate work of uniting powers that had spent centuries maintaining careful, wary distance from one another. Struck by the strange and humbling realization that his own existence, however unprecedented and however dangerous it had once seemed, had become, in the span of a single remarkable year, the catalyst for a unity the supernatural world had not managed to achieve in longer than even its oldest powers could comfortably measure. I keep thinking about something Ryzavim said to me, a long time ago, he told Rias, on a quiet evening during that week of careful, urgent diplomacy, the two of them sitting beneath the towering tree that had, across the preceding year, become a kind of quiet anchor for every difficult conversation that mattered. About being the answer to a question nobody else had thought to ask yet. I think this might be part of that answer. Not just what I choose to become on my own. What all of this, everyone uniting because of what I represent, might end up meaning for everyone, regardless of what happens to me specifically. You think you're more than just yourself, in this, Rias said, understanding arriving gently in her expression. That whatever happens next isn't only about your own survival anymore. I think it might be bigger than that, yeah, Issei admitted. I think the unmade chose me specifically because it thought I'd be the easiest thread to pull, to unravel everything else built on top of the world. But I think watching everyone come together this past week, the opposite might end up being true instead. I think I might end up being the reason everyone finally finds a way to stand together, instead of staying carefully, separately afraid of each other the way they have been for centuries. Rias considered this for a long moment, watching the tree's pale leaves stir gently in the evening breeze. I think that's possible, she said finally. And I think, whatever else happens in the days ahead, that alone would be worth everything this past year has cost you. Not because your own safety doesn't matter, because it does, more than almost anything else in my life. But because I think you're right that something larger than just your own story is taking shape here, and I think it's a genuinely good thing, regardless of how frightening the path toward it has been. The Coalition's formal assembly, when it finally completed 8 days later, gathered powers in a single shared purpose that the supernatural world had not witnessed since before the oldest wars any living being could clearly remember, devils and angels and Olympians and primordial powers all standing, together, in careful and deliberate unity against the threat that had, in trying to prove creation itself a mistake worth unmaking, accidentally provoked the largest and most genuine act of collective creation the world had seen in centuries. Issei stood at the center of that gathered coalition, feeling the weight of everything that had built toward this moment, and found, beneath the considerable fear of what still lay ahead, a quiet, settled certainty that whatever came next, he would not be facing it as the lonely, unprecedented anomaly the unmade had hoped to isolate and break. He would be facing it, instead, as the heart of something that had become, against every reasonable expectation, considerably larger than himself alone. The Unmade's full design revealed itself 3 days after the Coalition's formal assembly, delivered not through another dream visitation or another direct confrontation but through Ananke's careful, patient unraveling of the threads she had spent the preceding days tracing, the ancient embodiment of necessity finally presenting her findings to the assembled coalition with the same measured gravity she brought to everything. I have traced the shape of its intention as fully as my craft allows, she said, addressing the gathered powers in the same temporary council chamber Surzex had used for every major deliberation of the preceding year, though this assembly now held considerably more faces than any previous gathering, devils and angels and Olympians and primordial powers all present in careful, watchful unity. The Unmade does not intend, as I once feared, to simply overwhelm Issei through direct confrontation and force the catastrophic unmaking it failed to provoke in the training yard. It has chosen, instead, a considerably more patient and considerably more dangerous path. What kind of path? Surzex asked, his expression carrying the focused gravity of a leader bracing for difficult news. It intends to attack the Foundation itself, Ananke said. Not Issei directly, not any single target it might hope to break through pressure or temptation. It intends, instead, to strike at the first condition's own connection to this world, the ancient and largely dormant channel through which all creation, across every age, has ultimately drawn its existence. It believes, and I confess I cannot entirely refute the theoretical possibility, that if it can sever or corrupt that connection at its source, it may achieve the unmaking it desires regardless of whether Issei himself ever chooses to participate. The council chamber fell into a heavy, considering silence, the full scope of the threat settling over the gathered powers with a weight that made even the most composed among them visibly grave. That would mean Issei's choices, everything he's worked to prove this past year, wouldn't even matter, Rias said slowly, understanding arriving with unwelcome clarity. It's found a way around needing his cooperation at all. Precisely, Ananke confirmed. Which is, I believe, exactly why it has grown bolder in recent days, despite the resistance it encountered in the training yard. It no longer requires Issei to break. It requires only enough chaos and division among the powers who might otherwise oppose it to create the opportunity it needs to reach the ancient channel directly, here, in the place where that channel runs closest to the surface of the world, precisely because of Issei's own presence and connection to it. Then the coalition itself was never really about defeating it through unity alone, Azazel said grimly, working through the implications with his usual sharp, strategic clarity. It's about denying the Unmade the chaos and division it actually needs to succeed. Every faction standing together, refusing to fracture under pressure, that's not just a show of solidarity. That's the actual defense. Yes, Ananke confirmed. And I believe, given everything we have witnessed across these recent days, that the confrontation is no longer a matter of careful, patient timing on the unmate's part. I believe it intends to move directly and soon, having recognized that further delay only strengthens the unity currently standing against it. The Council's final hours of preparation that followed carried a focused, urgent intensity considerably different from the careful, deliberate training of the preceding months, every faction within the coalition working to align their considerable, varied strengths into something coherent enough to meet a threat that operated on a scale none of them had ever needed to individually plan against before. Issei spent those final hours in a manner that surprised even himself, choosing to spend the bulk of the remaining time not in frantic, last-minute training but in quiet, deliberate conversation with each member of his peerage in turn, a choice that Rias, watching him move thoughtfully from one careful conversation to the next, came to understand as its own kind of preparation, considerably more important, in its way, than any additional hour of combat drilling could have offered. I wanted you to know, he told Kaneko, finding her alone in the training yard's quiet garden, tending the gray-blossomed shrubs that had grown up around the tree's base, that whatever happens tomorrow, I'm grateful you told me the truth, that day, about being scared of what I might become. I think that honesty mattered more than you probably realize, in helping me become exactly what I actually wanted to become instead. Kaneko looked up at him, her usual guarded composure softening into something open and genuine. I'm not scared anymore, she said simply. I just wanted you to know that too, before tomorrow. He found similar quiet, meaningful moments with each of them in turn, Kiba's steady, grateful acknowledgement of the friendship that had grown between them since the night his offhand suggestion had unlocked Issei's full integrated power, Akino's warm, genuine affection carrying none of her usual teasing edge. The conversation settling instead into something quietly profound between two people who had fought beside each other through every crisis of the preceding year. It was his conversation with Rias, however, held in the quiet privacy of the clubroom as the evening before the coalition's planned mobilization finally deepened toward true night, that carried the full weight of everything the preceding year had built between them. I keep thinking about that first night, he said, when you found me on the roof, right after the raiding game, when I didn't know what I was or what I was going to become. I was so scared, Rias. Scared of myself, scared of hurting the people I cared about, scared of every single thing this entire journey turned out to actually involve. He took her hand, the gray light at his fingertips settling into its familiar, contented stillness despite the weight of what tomorrow promised to bring. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for staying anyway. For believing in who I could become before I had any real evidence to offer you that the belief was justified. You didn't need to thank me, Rias said softly. I'd have stayed regardless. I think I knew, even that first night, that whatever you turned out to be, it was going to be worth standing beside. She met his eyes, steady and certain despite the genuine fear underlying the coming day's confrontation. Whatever happens tomorrow, Issei, I want you to know that this past year, all of it, even the hardest parts, has been the best year of my life. I wouldn't trade a single moment of it, not even the fear, because the fear came bundled with watching you become exactly the person I always believed you could be. Issei pulled her close, the comfortable, familiar warmth of her presence settling over him like the steadiest ground he had found in this entire long and remarkable journey, and the two of them remained there a while longer, in the quiet privacy of the clubroom, gathering whatever strength and comfort they could find in each other's presence before the coalition's full mobilization, scheduled for first light, would carry them both into the largest and most consequential confrontation either of them had ever faced. Outside the clubroom window, Ko settled into its final ordinary night before everything changed, the gathered coalition's considerable forces quietly assembling at the territory's edge, devils and angels and Olympians and primordial powers united, at last, in a single shared purpose, waiting only for the dawn that would carry them all toward whatever ending, or beginning, the Unmade's final, desperate gambit had in store. Dawn arrived over Koa's territory with a stillness that felt, to everyone gathered at the coalition's assembled lines, considerably more significant than any ordinary sunrise had ever carried, the pale gold light spreading slowly across a battlefield that held, in careful and deliberate formation, the largest and most unprecedented gathering of supernatural power the modern world had ever witnessed. Surzex commanded the devil contingent from the formation's left flank, his considerable power held in careful, coiled readiness. Azazel's fallen angel forces anchored the right, their usual wariness toward devil cooperation set aside, for this single, urgent purpose, in favor of unified strategic positioning. Hermes and a contingent of Olympian forces, including, to Issei's quiet surprise, Athena herself, stern and composed and carrying a presence that made clear exactly why Olympus had chosen her council above so many others, held the formation's center alongside Nyx and Enki, the primordial powers lending their ancient, immeasurable weight to a coalition that had, in the span of little more than a week, achieved something centuries of careful diplomacy had never quite managed. Issei stood at the heart of it all, Rias at his side, the rest of his peerage arrayed around them in the formation they had practiced and refined across the preceding days, and felt, despite the considerable fear of what the coming confrontation promised, a settled, gathering certainty that whatever the unmade had hoped to provoke through chaos and division, it would not, today, find easy purchase against the unity standing arrayed before it. The unmade arrived without preamble, the same total, gravitational stillness Issei had felt twice before now manifesting on a scale considerably larger than anything the training yard confrontation had suggested, darkness spreading outward from a single point at the battlefield's center until it seemed to swallow the very horizon, the pale gold dawn light dimming, steadily, beneath its encroaching, patient hunger. "You have built quite a gathering," the unmade's voice said, resolving out of the vast darkness with the same perfect, total stillness it had carried in every previous encounter, though something in its tone now carried genuine, grudging acknowledgement of the scale of what stood arrayed against it. "I confess I did not anticipate quite this degree of unity, even accounting for the considerable affection you have apparently inspired across so many disparate and historically wary factions." "You wanted division," Issei called back, his voice carrying clearly across the vast, waiting silence of the battlefield. "You thought breaking me would be the easiest path to what you actually wanted. I think you're about to learn that trying to break me just ended up building something you can't break instead." "Perhaps," the unmade said, and the vast darkness began, slowly and with terrible, gathering purpose, to press inward against the coalition's assembled lines. "Or perhaps unity, however genuine, simply means I will need to unmake a great deal more, all at once, in order to reach the same conclusion I have always intended to reach. I find I am, in the end, entirely indifferent to which path proves necessary, so long as the destination remains the same." The battle that followed unfolded across a scale and a duration that none of the assembled coalition's individual factions had ever needed to coordinate before, devils and angels and Olympians and primordial powers each contributing their particular strengths against an enemy that pressed, relentlessly and from every direction at once, against the entire breadth of the coalition's assembled lines. Xerxes's power flared crimson bright against the unmade's encroaching dark, Athena's tactical brilliance coordinating the Olympian contingent's defense with a precision that held entire sections of the line steady against pressure that would otherwise have overwhelmed them, Nyx and Enki lending their immeasurable, ancient weight to the effort in ways that bent and redirected the unmade's assault without ever fully breaking its momentum. Issei fought at the heart of it all, weaving creation and unmaking together with a fluency that had become, across the preceding year, genuinely and entirely his own, raising barriers where the line threatened to break, mending wounds in the very fabric of the battlefield where the unmade's pressing darkness had begun to unravel the ground itself, and slowly, gradually, the coalition's unified strength began to do what no single faction could have managed alone, holding, steadily, against a threat that had expected, above all else, to find division and weakness at the first sign of genuine pressure. It was perhaps 2 hours into the engagement, as the battlefield itself had begun to bear the strange, abstract scars of forces considerably beyond ordinary combat, reality bending and rippling at the edges of every major clash, that the unmade finally turned its full, undivided attention back toward Issei directly, recognizing, with cold and patient calculation, that the coalition's unity, however genuine, ultimately drew its deepest strength from the boy standing at its center. "Enough," it said, and the vast darkness surrounding the battlefield suddenly contracted, focusing entirely toward Issei with a pressure that made every other engagement across the field seem, by comparison, like careful preamble. "I will end this where it actually matters. I will show you, child, exactly how little your careful coalition can do to protect you, when I choose to stop dividing my attention and focus it entirely toward the one thread I have always actually needed to unravel. The pressure that descended on Issei in that moment carried a weight considerably beyond anything he had faced in the training yard confrontation, the full, undivided focus of a being that had existed since before the first word disturbed its perfect stillness now bearing down on him with a totality that made even Risa's considerable power, flaring bright and desperate beside him, feel like the thinnest possible shield against an inevitability that had waited, patiently, for this exact moment. Issei felt himself staggering, the gray light at his fingertips flickering under pressure it had never before needed to withstand, and in that single, terrible, suspended moment, he understood, with a clarity that arrived alongside genuine fear, that he stood at the precise threshold the Unmade had always intended to bring him to, the point where pure, isolated strength would simply not prove sufficient. Regardless of how much he had grown across the preceding year, he did not face it alone. Risa's hand found his, steady and immediate, her own considerable power weaving directly into his faltering defense, and a heartbeat later, Akino's lightning split the darkness pressing against him, and Kiba's blade cut a path through the encroaching dark toward his side, and Kaniko's grounded, immovable strength anchored beneath his feet exactly where the battlefield itself had begun to waver. Surzex's voice rose above the chaos, directing the coalition's full strength toward the single point of pressure now bearing down on the boy at its center, and Nyx and Ananke and Athena and every other power who had chosen, across the preceding days, to stand with him rather than against him, turned, as one, toward the place where the Unmade had gambled everything on finding him alone. He was not alone. The realization arrived in Issei not as a sudden burst of overwhelming power but as something quieter and considerably more durable, the simple, settled understanding that the strength he needed in this moment had never actually been his alone to carry, that the entire preceding year, every alliance built, every relationship deepened, every choice made to build connection rather than retreat into isolated self-reliance, had been preparing him, all along, for exactly this moment, when isolated. Strength alone would never have proven sufficient. He reached, with the combined strength of everyone standing beside him lending weight to the gesture, not for unmaking, and not merely for the careful, deliberate creation he had practiced across the preceding months, but for something larger than either, a working that drew on the full, integrated breadth of everything he had become, dragon and void and the patient, accumulated love of everyone who had chosen to stand with him across this entire remarkable year. The gray light that rose from him in that moment did not press outward as a weapon, and did not rise as a simple defensive barrier. It rose, instead, as something closer to an answer, vast and deliberate and entirely his own, meeting the Unmade's total, isolating darkness not with equal and opposite force but with the full, accumulated weight of everything creation had ever actually meant, connection and choice and the patient, hard-won understanding that even an ending could be met, faced fully and without flinching, by something that had decided, deliberately and completely, to build rather than simply survive. The Unmade's pressing darkness met that rising light and, for the first time in the entire long confrontation, began, gradually and then with gathering speed, to falter. The Unmade's faltering did not arrive as sudden defeat, and Issei understood, even as he felt the ancient being's pressing darkness begin to waver against the rising light of his answer, that whatever came next would require considerably more than a single decisive blow, the kind of total, instantaneous victory that simpler battles sometimes offered. This is not possible, the Unmade said, and for the first time across every encounter Issei had endured with it, genuine uncertainty threaded through its perfect, total voice. I am older than connection. I am older than the very concept of choosing one thing over another. I existed in the silence before there was anything to choose between at all. You cannot simply answer me with something I predate. Maybe you predate it, Issei said, his voice steady despite the considerable strain of holding the working that continued to rise from him, drawing on the combined strength of everyone standing arrayed beside him. But I don't think that makes it weaker than you. I think it might actually make it stronger, because it's something that grew, deliberately, out of everything that came after you. You're the silence before the first word. This, all of this, everyone standing here together because they chose to, that's everything the first word actually made possible. I don't think silence beats that, just because it came first. The vast darkness surrounding the battlefield continued its gradual, uneven retreat, and Issei pressed the advantage with careful, deliberate intention, not seeking to unmake the ancient being entirely, a goal that some quiet, instinctive part of him understood might not even be possible against something so fundamentally woven into the nature of existence itself, but seeking instead, with the same patient creativity he had cultivated across the preceding year, to offer it something it had never, in all its long and patient existence, actually been offered before. "I'm not going to destroy you," he said, the rising light of his working settling, gradually, into something less like confrontation and more like a careful, extended hand. "I don't think I even can, not really, not completely. You're part of where I came from too, in your own way. The same stillness that birthed me birthed you, just shaped into something different." He felt the considerable strain of the working easing, slightly, as understanding settled into the gesture rather than simple, exhausting force. "But I don't think you have to keep being only that either. I changed. I came from the same silence you did, and I still changed into something that gets to choose what it builds. Maybe you can too." The vast darkness held very still, the entire battlefield suspended in a silence that felt, for a long, uncertain moment, considerably different from the cold, total stillness the unmade had carried into every previous encounter, something almost like genuine consideration settling, briefly, into the ancient being's vast and patient presence. "I have existed since before your kind had words to measure existence at all," it said finally, slowly, as though testing the shape of an idea it had genuinely never before considered. "I do not know if I am capable of becoming anything other than what I have always been. Neither did I, a year ago," Issei said gently. "I didn't know if I was capable of anything except being afraid of myself. I think the only way to actually find out is to choose to try." The standoff held for a long, suspended moment, the entire coalition watching, breathless, as the ancient and patient weight of the unmade's presence wavered between the total, gravitational pull of everything it had always been and the strange, unprecedented possibility Issei had just offered it, and when the darkness finally began, gradually, and without any further confrontation, to withdraw entirely from the battlefield, it carried with it not the cold, total finality of defeat, but something considerably more uncertain, the particular quality of a being that had been offered, for the first time in an unmeasurable span of existence, a genuine question it had never before needed to answer. "I make no promise," the unmade said, its voice retreating along with the dissolving darkness, the pale gold dawn light beginning, slowly, to reclaim the battlefield it had nearly swallowed entirely. "I do not know if I am capable of the choosing you describe. But I find, against every expectation I carried into this confrontation, that I am no longer entirely certain I do not wish to try." A pause weighted with something that might, in a being of its nature, have approached genuine and unfamiliar curiosity. "I will withdraw, for now, to consider what you have offered me. Do not mistake this for surrender, child. But do not mistake it, either, for the unchanged certainty I carried into this battlefield this morning." It was gone a moment later, the vast darkness dissolving entirely back into the ordinary dawn light, and the battlefield, in the sudden, settling quiet that followed, erupted into the particular chaos of a coalition's exhausted, disbelieving relief, devils and angels and Olympians and primordial powers alike lowering weapons and power alike, the shared tension of the preceding hours finally, gradually releasing. Issei sank to his knees amid the settling quiet, the considerable strain of the working finally catching up with him fully now that the immediate crisis had passed, and felt Rias's arms around him a moment later, her own exhaustion plain in every line of her, though her grip carried nothing but fierce, overwhelming relief. "You did it," she said, her voice carrying a wonder that matched the disbelief rippling across the entire assembled coalition. "You actually did it. You didn't destroy it. You offered it something else instead." "I don't know if it actually worked," Issei admitted, his voice carrying genuine, exhausted uncertainty even amid the relief of the moment. "It didn't promise anything. It just said it would think about it. That's still more than anyone else has ever managed against something like that," Serzek said, arriving at his side with the rest of the coalition's leadership, his expression carrying a depth of genuine respect that extended well beyond the formal, careful diplomacy of his previous interactions with Issei. I do not know of a single account, in any record this underworld has ever maintained, of a being like the unmade being offered anything other than confrontation. You gave it something else entirely. Whatever comes of that, the offering itself is remarkable. Nyx and Ananke arrived together, their ancient features carrying expressions that mixed genuine awe with something that looked, on faces so old, and so accustomed to careful, measured reserve, almost like hope. I have lived since before this world's current age began, Nyx said softly. I did not believe, walking onto this battlefield, that anything short of total confrontation could meet a threat of that magnitude. You have shown me something today I did not believe I would ever witness. She inclined her head toward him, the gesture carrying a depth of respect that extended well beyond her previous, careful courtesy. Whatever you choose to build from this moment forward, child of the first condition, I believe the entire world, old and new alike, will be considerably better for your having chosen to build it. The battlefield, in the hours that followed, settled gradually into the careful, exhausted work of aftermath. The coalition's gathered forces tending to the considerable strain the confrontation had placed on every faction present, and Issei, supported by Rias and the rest of his peerage as the adrenaline of the preceding hours finally, fully drained away, found himself looking out over a battlefield that had, against every reasonable expectation he had carried into the dawn, become the site, not of catastrophic ending but of something closer to an unprecedented, fragile beginning. He did not know, in that exhausted, settling moment, exactly what the unmade's eventual answer would be, or whether the ancient being's strange, unfamiliar consideration would ever resolve into the genuine change he had dared to hope for. But he understood, watching the gathered coalition's exhausted, relieved unity settling around him, that whatever came next, the long and remarkable year that had carried him from a frightened boy in a ruined building to the heart of this unprecedented gathering had finally, fully proven exactly what he had always hoped it might. Creation, chosen deliberately and held to fiercely even against the oldest and most patient unmaking the world had ever produced, could hold. Could win, not through destruction, but through the simple, hard-won, endlessly renewable strength of choosing, again and again, to build something worth defending in the first place. The days immediately following the battlefield confrontation carried a strange, suspended quality, the entire coalition still absorbing the full scope of what had occurred, the careful, formal structures of Underworld and Olympus and every primordial power who had stood together settling, slowly, back into their separate and familiar rhythms while the unprecedented unity that had carried them through the crisis lingered. Quietly, in the considerable goodwill it left behind, Issei spent much of that first week in a state of careful, deliberate recovery, the sheer scale of the working he had sustained against the unmade's full pressure leaving him, for the first time since the earliest days of learning to control his power, genuinely and thoroughly exhausted in a manner that no amount of training had previously demanded of him. Rias oversaw his recovery with the same patient, steady attention she had brought to every previous crisis, and the rest of the peerage took turns, across those quiet days, simply sitting with him beneath the towering tree, the ordinary, comfortable companionship of friends who had weathered something enormous together and needed, now, mostly just the easy reassurance of each other's presence. Do you think it'll actually come back? Kiba asked, on one of those quiet afternoons, watching Issei carefully tend the strange root and stone barrier that had grown up from his desperate creation in the earlier training yard confrontation, the structure having settled, in the weeks since, into something that looked less like a defensive wall and more like a deliberately cultivated garden feature. The unmade, I mean. Do you think it'll actually consider what you offered it? I don't know, Issei admitted honestly. I think about it a lot, actually. Whether something that old, that fundamentally built around being exactly what it's always been, can actually change just because someone asked it to try. He looked up at the tree's pale, towering branches, the steady, quiet growth of something he had built, deliberately, out of nothing at all. But I think the asking mattered anyway, even if it never changes. I think that's actually the whole point of what I learned this past year. You don't get to control what other people, or other beings, eventually choose to become. You only get to control what you offer them, and what you choose for yourself, regardless of how they answer. It was Ananke who brought, 11 days after the battlefield confrontation, the first genuine indication that the unmade's strange, unfamiliar consideration had not simply dissolved back into its old, unchanged certainty, arriving at the training yard with an expression that carried, on her ancient and rarely expressive features, something that looked unmistakably like cautious wonder. "I have felt a change in the old threads," she said, settling into the training yard's quiet with the same measured gravity she brought to every significant pronouncement. "Small and uncertain, and I would not call it resolution, not yet. But the unmade's presence, which I have tracked across the long centuries of my existence as a single, unchanging point of total stillness, has begun, in the days since your confrontation, to show the faintest suggestion of movement. Not action. Simply movement, the way still water finally stirs after an immeasurable span of perfect calm." She studied Issei with an intensity that carried genuine respect beneath its careful, ancient reserve. "I do not know what this movement will eventually become. But I do not believe, child, that a being so fundamentally unchanging would stir at all, however faintly, unless something you offered it had genuinely, however slightly, begun to take root." The news carried through the coalition's remaining structures with a quiet, cautious hope that settled, gradually, into something like genuine optimism about the shape of whatever came next, and Issei found himself, in the weeks that followed, settling into a strange and unfamiliar new rhythm, the constant, low-grade vigilance that had defined so much of the preceding year giving way, slowly, to something that felt, for the first time in longer than he could comfortably remember, like genuine, settled peace. The formal recognition that followed, arranged jointly by Sirs X and Athena in a ceremony that drew representatives from every faction within the coalition, carried none of the careful, anxious political maneuvering of the previous year's gatherings, settling instead into something closer to genuine celebration. The assembled powers of Underworld and Olympus and the ancient primordial realms gathering not to debate Issei's status or weigh his potential danger, but simply to formally acknowledge, with unanimous and genuine warmth, exactly what his existence, and his choices across this remarkable and difficult year, had come to mean for the wider architecture of their interconnected world. "A year ago," Sirzek said, addressing the gathered assembly with a warmth that carried none of his usual formal political weight, "this council debated, at considerable and anxious length, what to do about an unprecedented power that had surfaced, unbidden, in the heart of a quiet devil territory. We worried, many of us, about danger, about containment, about the careful political calculations such an unprecedented existence might require." He looked toward Issei, his expression carrying genuine, unguarded pride. "I do not think any of us, in that anxious early debate, dared to hope we might instead be standing here, a year later, having watched that same unprecedented power become the very foundation of the largest and most genuine unity this world has witnessed in longer than even our oldest records can comfortably measure." The applause that followed, carrying across factions that had spent centuries maintaining careful, wary distance from one another, settled over Issei with a warmth that felt, in that moment, like the clearest possible answer to every fear he had carried in those earliest, frightened days, the simple, settled understanding that whatever he had once feared himself capable of becoming, the actual answer, hard-won and entirely his own, had turned out to be something the entire watching world had genuine reason to celebrate. That evening, walking back toward the old school building beneath a sky thick with stars, Rias's hand in his, Issei found himself turning over the full shape of everything the preceding year had built, from the frightened uncertainty of a single paused breath of wind outside a flower shop to the unprecedented unity of an entire supernatural world standing together against the oldest and most patient threat any of them had ever faced. "What happens now?" he asked, the question carrying less anxious uncertainty than genuine, open curiosity about whatever came next. "Now that the immediate crisis is actually over." "Now," Rias said, leaning against him with the easy, comfortable familiarity that had become, across this entire remarkable year, their particular and treasured rhythm, "I think we get to find out what an actual, ordinary future looks like, built on top of everything we've survived together. I think that might be the strangest and most welcome part of all of this." Issei smiled, looking up at the wide, star-scattered sky above Ko, and found, for the first time since this entire extraordinary journey began, that the question of what came next carried no fear in it at all, only the quiet, settled anticipation of a future he had, at last, genuinely earned the chance to build. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, past the flower shop with its shutters drawn for the night, past the bakery where the same delivery truck still idled most mornings arguing cheerfully about missing crates, past every small, ordinary landmark that had witnessed, without ever quite realizing it, the full and improbable shape of everything Issei had become across this single remarkable year. The town slept on around them, unaware and untroubled, exactly as it always had, and Issei found a quiet, grateful comfort in that ordinariness, in the knowledge that whatever vast and ancient forces had spent the preceding year weighing his existence, the simple, unremarkable streets of his own home had remained, throughout all of it, exactly as gentle and unchanged as they had been the morning the wind first, briefly, paused outside a flower shop. "I think I finally understand something Pythia told me, that very first day," he said, as they reached the quiet corner where their paths would soon split toward their separate homes. "She said I should be gentle with myself when it finally spoke, whatever was sleeping inside me. I spent so long thinking that meant being careful, being cautious, treating the power like something fragile that might break if I pushed too hard." He shook his head slowly, a small, genuine smile touching his expression. "I don't think that's what she actually meant anymore. I think she meant I should be patient with becoming, the same patience you'd show anything still growing into what it's meant to be. Not careful out of fear. Patient out of trust." Rias considered this for a long moment, something thoughtful and warm settling over her features in the soft glow of the streetlight above them. "I think that might be the truest thing anyone's said about all of this, in the whole year since it started," she said. "And I think you've more than earned the right to claim that patience now, instead of just hoping for it." They lingered a moment longer at the corner, reluctant, as they so often were lately, to let the evening's quiet companionship end, and when they finally did part ways, Issei carried the warmth of the conversation with him the rest of the way home, settling into sleep that night without a single trace of the old, watchful dread that had once kept him staring at his ceiling long past midnight, wondering what strange new piece of himself the morning might reveal. He slept, instead, the deep and easy sleep of someone who had finally, fully made peace with every part of what he carried, and dreamed, for the first time in longer than he could remember, of absolutely nothing more remarkable than an ordinary, sunlit morning waiting for him at the end of it. Spring arrived in Ko the way it always had, gradually and then all at once, the cherry trees along the main road bursting into pale pink bloom within the span of a single warm week, and Issei found himself, walking beneath that familiar seasonal color on an ordinary Saturday morning, struck by how strange and welcome it felt to simply notice the beauty of an ordinary thing without some watchful, anxious part of his mind cataloging it for potential danger. 3 months had passed since the battlefield confrontation with the Unmade, 3 months that had settled, gradually and almost disbelievingly, into something Issei had not allowed himself to fully hope for across the preceding eventful year: genuine, uninterrupted peace. Ananke's careful tracking of the old threads continued to report the same faint, uncertain movement in the Unmade's ancient and unchanging presence. No resolution yet, no clear answer to the question Issei had offered it on that battlefield, but no return to hostility either, the vast and patient being apparently settled, for now, into whatever genuinely unprecedented process of consideration his offer had set into motion. The tree in the training yard had grown, in those 3 months, to a height that now shaded nearly half the entire space, its pale silvered branches thick with the same gentle gray blossoms that had first bloomed around its base more than a year before, and Issei had taken, in the easy peace of recent weeks, to spending quiet mornings there before school, simply sitting beneath its branches with a cup of tea, watching Ko wake into another ordinary day. It was beneath that tree, on this particular spring morning, that Rias found him, settling beside him on the low stone bench with the same easy, comfortable familiarity that had become, across more than a year of partnership, entirely natural between them. "You look thoughtful," she observed, accepting the second cup of tea he had, by now, simply learned to prepare in anticipation of her arrival. "I was thinking about how strange it is," Issei admitted, "that I almost don't know what to do with myself now that nothing's actively trying to test, threaten, or recruit me. I spent so long bracing for the next crisis that peace feels like it should come with some kind of catch." "I think that's a very understandable thing to feel, after the year we've had," Rias said gently. But I don't think it has to come with a catch. I think sometimes peace is just peace, and the bracing instinct just takes a while longer to actually believe that. They sat together in comfortable quiet for a while, the morning light filtering gently through the trees' pale branches, and it was in that quiet, unhurried stillness that Issei found himself turning over a thought that had been building, slowly and with increasing clarity, across the preceding weeks of genuine peace. "I've been thinking about something," he said finally. "About what I actually want to do with all of this, now that I'm not just constantly surviving the next thing. I told you, a while back, that I wanted to build something good with this power, not just defend against threats as they came. I think I finally have a clearer idea of what that might actually look like." "Tell me," Ria said, genuine curiosity warming her expression. "I want to build a sanctuary," Issei said, the idea arriving with a clarity that suggested he had been turning it over, privately, for considerably longer than this single conversation. "Somewhere people who don't fit neatly into any of the established categories, devils or angels or anything else, somewhere they could come and just be safe, the way I wish I'd had somewhere safe to go in those first frightening weeks when I didn't understand what I was becoming. A place built on exactly what I learned to choose, creation instead of fear, welcome instead of suspicion." He looked at her, something hopeful and a little nervous in his expression. "I think I could actually build it, with this power. Not just protect a place. Actually grow it, the way I grew this tree, deliberately, with intention." Rias considered the idea with the same careful, genuine attention she brought to every significant proposal he had ever offered her, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried unmistakable warmth. "I think that's a beautiful idea," she said. "And I think it's exactly the kind of thing the wider world needs more of, especially now, after everything the Coalition built fighting the unmade together. A physical place, grown out of that same spirit of unity and welcome, rather than just the temporary alliance of a crisis." She took his hand, her expression growing thoughtful. "Where would you even begin building something like that?" "I don't know yet," Issei admitted, with a small, genuine laugh. "I've got the idea. I haven't quite figured out all the practical details. But I think that's all right. I think the idea mattering enough to start is probably more important than having every detail figured out before I begin." The proposal, once raised formally before Surzex and the broader coalition leadership in the weeks that followed, met with a reception considerably warmer than Issei had quietly dared to expect. The assembled powers who had fought beside him on that battlefield 3 months before recognizing immediately, and with genuine enthusiasm, the value of a physical, lasting symbol of exactly the unity their unprecedented coalition had proven possible. "A sanctuary built on neutral ground," Athena observed, during the formal council session convened to discuss the proposal, her sharp, strategic mind already working through the practical implications with evident interest, "open to any being regardless of faction or origin, grown and maintained by someone whose very existence has already proven the value of unity over division. I think this could become something considerably more significant than even you currently anticipate, Issei Hyoudou. A place where the next unprecedented being, whoever and whenever they eventually emerge, might find welcome rather than the fear and suspicion you yourself were forced to overcome." The location, once the council's deliberations finally settled on a suitable site, a quiet stretch of neutral territory at the careful intersection of underworld, Olympian, and ordinary human land, claimed by no single faction and contested by none, felt, to Issei, like exactly the right foundation for what he intended to build, and he began the work, in the weeks that followed, with the same patient, deliberate care he had once brought to learning the basic, halting first steps of inviting the gray light to answer his call at all. It started small, a single seed of the same pale, silvered growth that had first bloomed in the training yard, planted in careful, deliberate ceremony attended by representatives from every faction within the coalition, devils and angels and Olympians and primordial powers alike gathered together, once more, not for crisis or confrontation this time, but for the quiet, hopeful work of building something new. Issei knelt before the planted seed, Rias and his entire peerage gathered close behind him, and reached, with the same deliberate intention he had cultivated across this entire remarkable year, for the gray light at his fingertips, inviting it forward not in defense, not in confrontation, but in simple, hopeful creation. The seed stirred, and began, slowly and with patient, deliberate growth, to take root. The sanctuary grew, over the following months, with a pace that surprised even Issei. The patient, deliberate care he poured into its daily tending yielding results considerably faster and considerably more beautiful than the slow, careful growth of the original tree in Koa's training yard had ever managed, as though the working itself had grown stronger and more fluent through every month of practice across the preceding year. The accumulated skill of countless smaller creations now lending its full, confident weight to this single, larger, and more deliberate purpose. Within 2 months, the central tree had grown to a height that rivaled the old-school building itself, its vast canopy of pale silvered leaves casting cool, dappled shade across grounds that had, in that same span of time, begun to take on the unmistakable shape of genuine sanctuary, low stone paths winding between carefully tended gardens, a series of modest, welcoming structures grown from the same patient creative working that had first produced the tree itself, each building carrying a quality that felt less constructed than cultivated, organic curves and warm, living wood that seemed, somehow, to have simply grown into exactly the shape its purpose required. Word of the sanctuary's existence spread, gradually and then with gathering momentum, through the same old channels that had once carried rumors of an unprecedented and uncategorized power surfacing in a quiet devil territory, except now the word carried an entirely different character, an invitation rather than a warning. News of a place built specifically to welcome exactly the kind of beings the wider supernatural world had never quite known how to categorize or contain. The first visitor arrived within the sanctuary's 3rd month, a young stray devil who had spent years avoiding both the established underworld hierarchy and the dangerous, desperate cells that preyed on devils without peerage or protection, drawn by careful, quiet rumors of a place where her particular, uncertain status would not mark her as either threat or prey. Issei met her himself, at the sanctuary's gate, and felt, watching her cautious, hopeful uncertainty settle gradually into genuine relief as she understood the welcome was real and freely offered, a quiet, profound satisfaction that exceeded, in its own gentle way, even the considerable triumph of the battlefield confrontation months before. "I didn't think a place like this could actually exist," she said, sitting with him beneath the great tree's canopy that first afternoon, her voice carrying the particular wonder of someone who had spent considerable time without daring to hope for exactly this kind of welcome. "Somewhere that doesn't care what faction I belong to, or whether I'm useful to anyone's hierarchy. It exists because someone built it on purpose," Issei said simply. "I spent a long time afraid of what made me different. I don't want anyone else to have to spend that same kind of time alone with that fear, if there's something I can actually do to offer them somewhere safer to land instead." More visitors followed in the weeks and months after, a slow but steady trickle that gradually became a genuine and welcome population, stray devils and minor fallen angels who had fallen through the cracks of their own faction's careful hierarchies, the occasional curious minor deity from pantheons too small and too quiet to warrant the careful diplomatic attention Olympus or the underworld typically commanded, even. On one memorable occasion, a young dragon, barely more than a hatchling, whose unusual coloring had marked her as an outcast among her own kind, finding in the sanctuary's quiet, unconditional welcome exactly the belonging she had been unable to find anywhere else. Rias became, over those same months, an essential partner in the sanctuary's growth, her own considerable skill at diplomacy and organization shaping the loose, organic welcome Issei's creative power provided into something genuinely sustainable, careful systems for ensuring visitors found not just shelter but genuine community, structured but gentle. Practical guidance for those seeking to eventually rejoin established factions, and equally genuine support for those who simply wished to remain within the sanctuary's welcoming grounds indefinitely. "You built the bones of this place," she told him, one evening, the two of them walking together through gardens that had, in the span of half a year, become genuinely, vibrantly alive with the quiet community they had gathered. "But I think what actually makes it work, what actually makes it feel like sanctuary rather than just shelter, is the way you've insisted, from the very beginning, that everyone here gets to choose what they become here, the same way you insisted on choosing for yourself. I couldn't have built any of the actual structure without you, though," Issei said, looking around at the careful, thoughtful system she had woven through every part of the sanctuary's daily life. I'm good at growing things. You're the one who figured out how to make sure what grew here actually held together, instead of just being a beautiful place that fell apart the first time it needed real organization. It was on one particular evening, perhaps 8 months after the sanctuary's founding, walking together through gardens lit gold by a settling sunset, that Issei finally asked the question he had been privately turning over for considerably longer than he had let himself admit, even to himself. Rias, he said, stopping beneath an arch of pale, blossoming branches that he had grown, deliberately, months before, anticipating, in some quiet corner of himself, exactly this moment without fully realizing he had been planning for it. I've spent the past year and a half building things. The tree and co. This entire sanctuary. A whole new way of understanding what I actually am, and what I actually want to become. He took her hands, his heart pounding with a nervousness that felt, after everything they had survived together, both entirely new and entirely familiar. But I think the most important thing I've ever built, the thing I actually want to spend the rest of my life tending and growing, is whatever this is between us. I love you, Rias. Not because of the politics, not because of anything except exactly who you are, and exactly everything you've chosen to be beside me through every part of this remarkable, difficult, wonderful year and a half. Rias's expression, in the gold light of the settling sun, carried an openness and a warmth that needed no further words to convey her answer, though she offered them anyway, her voice carrying a certainty that matched everything they had built together across the preceding months. I love you too, she said simply. I think I have for a very long time now, longer than I let myself fully admit, even to myself. And I think, watching everything you've built, everything you've chosen to become, I've never been more certain of anything than I am that I want to keep building this future beside you, for as long as we both choose it. The kiss that followed, gentle and certain beneath the pale blossoming arch Issei had grown without fully understanding why, carried the full, accumulated weight of everything the preceding year and a half had built between them, every fear faced together, every choice made deliberately and with open eyes, settling, finally and completely, into something neither of them needed any further words to define. The sanctuary's gardens, around them, continued their quiet, patient growth, witness to a moment that felt, in its own gentle way, like the truest and most lasting creation either of them had ever helped bring into the world. 2 years to the day after the morning the wind had first, briefly and inexplicably, paused outside a flower shop in Co. Issei stood at the heart of the sanctuary he had built, watching a community that had grown, in that span of time, into something considerably larger and more vibrant than he had ever quietly dared to imagine on the evening he first proposed the idea beneath the original tree's pale branches. The sanctuary now sprawled across grounds considerably larger than its modest beginning, the great central tree joined by a dozen smaller groves Issei had grown over the intervening months, each one cultivated with a particular community or purpose in mind, a quiet grove for meditation and healing, a vibrant orchard whose fruit, Issei had discovered through careful and delighted experimentation, carried small, gentle properties that seemed to ease whatever particular burden its grower had been thinking of as they tended it, a wide, open meadow where visiting dragons, drawn by word of the young hatchling who had found belonging there months before, now gathered in numbers that would have seemed impossible to imagine in the sanctuary's earliest days. Surzex visited often, in those intervening months, drawn as much by genuine personal affection for the place and its purpose as by the formal diplomatic value the underworld continued to find in maintaining close, warm relations with an institution that had become, gradually and almost without anyone fully planning it, one of the most genuinely respected neutral grounds across every major faction in the supernatural world. I still remember the council session where half this room debated whether you represented a danger requiring containment, he told Issei, on one such visit, the two of them walking together through the orchard's quiet, fruit-laden rows. I don't think any of us, in that anxious early debate, could have imagined we'd be standing here, 2 years later, in a place that has become, by every measure available to us, one of the genuine treasures of our entire interconnected world. I think about that council session sometimes too, Issei admitted, mostly with gratitude that you and Rias and the others who actually believed in me outnumbered the ones who didn't. I don't know what would have happened to all of this, to me, honestly, if that vote had gone differently. It didn't though, Surzex said simply. And I think, watching everything you've built since, that the choice this council made that day remains one of the wisest decisions I've personally been part of in my considerable span of years leading this underworld. It was Ananke who brought, on a quiet afternoon some months later, the news that finally, fully resolved the long uncertainty surrounding the unmate's fate, arriving at the sanctuary with an expression Issei had never before seen on her ancient, careful features, something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine and profound wonder. It has answered, she said, without preamble, the moment she found Issei tending the central tree's lowest branches. The unmade. After 2 years of the faintest, most uncertain movement in its ancient threads, it has finally, fully answered the question you offered it on that battlefield. Issei felt his breath catch, the considerable weight of 2 years' uncertain waiting suddenly, fully present. What did it say? It did not say anything, precisely, Ananke said, something almost like a smile touching her careful, ancient features. It simply changed. The total, unchanging stillness I have tracked since before your kind had words to measure existence has, for the first time in all my long centuries of careful observation, genuinely shifted. It has not become creation, not in the manner you yourself embody. I do not believe such complete transformation was ever truly possible for a being so fundamentally built around what it has always been. But it has become, I believe, something considerably gentler than the patient, hungry stillness it once was. A quiet, watchful presence rather than an active, hostile one. A being that has chosen, in whatever fashion remains available to its ancient and fundamentally unchanging nature, to simply rest, rather than to actively seek the total unmaking it once believed was the only answer worth pursuing. It's not going to come back and try again, Issei said, understanding arriving slowly, the relief of it settling over him with a depth that surprised him even after 2 years of relative peace. I do not believe so, Ananke confirmed. I believe, in its own fashion, it took your offer seriously, even if the change it found within itself proved smaller and more modest than the genuine creative choosing you yourself have demonstrated. I believe, in the end, you offered it the one thing in all its long and patient existence it had never before been offered, the simple, genuine respect of being asked, rather than simply confronted or ignored. I believe that respect, more than any battlefield victory could have managed, is what finally allowed it to find whatever small and quiet peace it has settled into now. The news settled over Issei with a profound, quiet gratitude, the final, lingering thread of uncertainty from that remarkable and difficult confrontation finally, fully resolved, and he found himself, that evening, sharing the news with Rias beneath the great central tree, the two of them sitting together in the same comfortable, settled quiet that had become, across 2 remarkable years, their most treasured shared rhythm. Do you ever think about how different all of this could have gone? Rias asked, watching the sanctuary's gentle evening activity continue around them, visitors and residents alike settling into their own quiet evening routines across the grounds Issei had grown from nothing more than a single careful seed. If you'd made different choices somewhere along the way. If the council had voted differently, or if Ryzavim's tests had broken you instead of teaching you, or if the unmate's offer of rest had actually tempted you past the point of resistance. I think about it sometimes, Issei admitted. But I don't dwell on it much anymore. I think the version of events that actually happened, every difficult choice, every hard-won lesson, every person who chose to stand beside me even when standing beside me carried real risk, I think that's the version that actually matters now. I wouldn't trade it, even knowing how frightening parts of it were while I was living through them. He looked around at the sanctuary's gentle, thriving evening life, at the people who had found belonging within its grounds, at the woman beside him who had believed in him before he had any real evidence to justify that belief. I think this is exactly what I was always supposed to build, even if I didn't understand that yet, back when I was just a frightened kid standing in a ruined building with no memory of what had just happened to the sword that should have killed me. Rias's hand found his, the familiar, grounding warmth of 2 years' accumulated partnership settling over the quiet evening, and the two of them sat together beneath the great tree's pale, rustling branches, watching the sanctuary they had built together continue its gentle, ongoing work of offering exactly the welcome and the belonging that the wider, older world had so rarely managed to extend on its own. On a warm spring morning, 3 years after the wind had first paused outside a flower shop on an ordinary coast street, Issei Hyoudou stood once more in the place where that strange, unprecedented journey had truly begun, the training yard behind the old school building, the original tree, the very first thing he had ever deliberately grown rather than unmade, now towering above the entire familiar courtyard. Its pale silvered branches thick with blossoms that drifted, gently, on the same ordinary spring breeze that stirred the cherry trees along the main road into town. The occasion gathering them there carried none of the anxious, crisis-driven urgency of so many previous occasions across the preceding years. Surzek stood beside Sona, the two of them deep in easy, comfortable conversation about the sanctuary's continued growth. Nyx and Ananke had both made the journey, their ancient, careful presences settled, for once, into something that looked genuinely like simple, unhurried enjoyment of an ordinary, happy gathering. Hermes had arrived with his usual theatrical flourish, bearing, this time, an actual formal gift from Olympus rather than a careful diplomatic warning, and even Azazel had set aside his customary irreverence long enough to offer Issei a genuine, warm embrace before the proceedings began. Rias stood at the center of it all, in the soft white and gold of the day, and Issei found himself, watching her cross the courtyard toward him beneath the tree's drifting blossoms, struck by the same overwhelming, grateful wonder that had carried him through every significant moment of the preceding 3 years, the simple, profound miracle of having found, in the midst of everything strange and difficult his existence had demanded, someone who had chosen him, fully and completely, every single day since. The ceremony itself was simple, intimate despite the considerable and varied company gathered to witness it, devil and angel and Olympian and primordial alike standing together beneath the tree that had become, across 3 remarkable years, the quiet, living symbol of everything Issei had chosen to build rather than destroy. Surzek, by mutual and warm agreement, presided over the formal exchange of vows, and when Issei finally took Rias's hands in his own, the gray light at his fingertips settling, as it always did now, into quiet, contented stillness, he found the words arriving with the same easy, settled certainty that had carried him through every genuine choice of this entire extraordinary journey. "I used to be afraid of what I might become," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered, attentive crowd. "I spent the earliest part of this whole strange story terrified that whatever slept inside me would eventually take something away from the people I loved, that the power I carried was something to be feared and carefully contained rather than something I could ever actually trust myself to wield well." He looked at Rias, the depth of 3 years' accumulated love and partnership settling fully into his expression. "You're the reason I learned to choose differently. Every evening you stayed in this exact training yard, helping me learn to invite the light instead of fearing it. Every time you believed in who I could become before I had any real evidence to offer you that the belief was justified. I wouldn't be standing here today, the person I actually am, without every single choice you made to stand beside me instead of stepping back." Rias's answering vow carried its own quiet, profound certainty, the words settling over the gathered crowd with the same warm, unguarded openness that had defined her partnership with Issei since the very earliest days of this remarkable journey. "I gambled everything, that first night I found you dying on a roadside, on the simple belief that you were worth saving," she said. "I had no idea, then, exactly what that gamble would eventually reveal, no idea that the boy I revived with 8 pawn pieces would turn out to carry something as vast and unprecedented as the first condition itself. But I think, looking back across everything we've survived and built together, I would have made that same choice anyway, even knowing everything that followed, because the person you've become, the choices you've made, the sanctuary you've built, every single piece of who you actually are, has been worth every moment of fear and every ounce of effort this journey has demanded of both of us." She squeezed his hands, her eyes bright with genuine, overflowing joy. "I love you, Issei Hyoudou, not despite everything strange and unprecedented about your existence, but because of exactly who you chose to become within it." The gathered crowd's applause rose warm and genuine around them, devils and angels and ancient primordial powers alike celebrating, together, a union that had become, across 3 remarkable years, the quiet, settled heart of everything the wider supernatural world had learned to build together in the wake of crisis and confrontation. That evening, as the celebration gradually wound down into comfortable, easy conversation among the gathered guests, Issei found a quiet moment to slip away to the sanctuary's edge with Rias, the two of them standing together beneath a sky just beginning to fill with the first scattered stars of true evening, looking out over a world that had, across the span of their shared and remarkable journey, learned to make genuine, lasting space for exactly the kind of unprecedented existence he had once feared might never find a place to truly belong. 3 years ago, he said quietly, I didn't even know what I was. I just knew the wind had stopped outside a flower shop, and that something about that felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. He looked at her, the gray light at his fingertips settling into the same quiet, contented stillness that had become, across this entire journey, simply another part of who he was. I don't think that frightened kid could have ever imagined this. The sanctuary. The coalition. You standing beside me, choosing this, choosing all of it, every single day since. I don't think any of us could have imagined it, Rias said softly, leaning into him with the easy, comfortable warmth of 3 years' accumulated partnership. But I think that's exactly what makes it matter so much. Nobody handed this to us. We built it, choice by choice, even when building felt harder than simply giving in to fear would have been. They stood together in comfortable, settled silence, watching the stars continue their slow emergence across the deepening sky, the sanctuary's gentle evening life continuing quietly around them, every resident and every visitor finding, in their own particular way, exactly the welcome and belonging Issei had once dreamed of building when he was still nothing more than a frightened boy trying to understand what slept beneath his own skin. He thought, in that quiet, settled moment, of Pythia's riddles in the courtyard, of Drake's ancient unease, of the long, difficult, remarkable journey that had carried him from a single paused breath of wind to this exact moment, standing beside the woman he loved, at the heart of a sanctuary built entirely from the deliberate, hard-won choice to create rather than destroy. He had not known, in those earliest frightened days, what he was becoming. He knew now, with a settled, complete certainty that needed no further testing, no further proof, no further validation from any power, ancient or otherwise, who might still, somewhere in the wide and watching world, wonder exactly what to make of his unprecedented existence. He was Issei Hyoudou. He had been given a vast and ancient inheritance he had never asked for, and he had chosen, deliberately and completely, exactly what to build with it. And as the stars settled fully into place above the sanctuary he had grown from nothing more than a single careful seed, Issei found himself, at last, entirely and peacefully home.